She thought one bowl of soup would save a life. Instead, it signed her death warrant. Magnolia Sterling stood on the marble steps of her father's mansion, watching smoke rise from the distant hills. The silk dress she wore cost more than most families earned in a year, but her hands trembled as she held a simple wooden bowl filled with warm broth. Across the sprawling courtyard, a man lay crumpled against the stone fountain, his dark skin torn by fresh wounds, his breathing shallow and desperate. She had found him there at dawn, collapsed and bleeding, his leather clothing marking him as one of the native tribes her father spent his days cursing. Every instinct told her to call the ranch hands, to have him removed before Clayton Sterling discovered this trespasser on his precious land. But something in the stranger's eyes, a flicker of humanity beneath the pain, made her pause. The mansion around her represented everything her father had built through decades of expansion and conquest. Room after room of imported furniture, crystal chandeliers and oil paintings that depicted a world she had never seen. Yet here, in this moment, all that luxury felt hollow compared to the simple act of offering food to someone who needed it. Magnolia knelt beside the wounded man, her dress pooling in the dust despite her mother's voice echoing in her memory about proper behavior. The stranger's eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face with a mixture of surprise and wariness. When she extended the bowl toward him, his weathered hands shook as he accepted it. He drank deeply, and for a moment, relief washed over his features. But as he handed the empty bowl back to her, his expression changed to something she couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with what looked almost like pity. "You don't know what you've done," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning wind. Before Magnolia could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard. Her father's voice boomed from somewhere near the stables, growing closer with each passing second. The stranger struggled to his feet, his movements urgent despite his injuries. "They will come for you now," he said, backing toward the tree line that bordered the property. "Because of what you've shown me, they will come." The hoofbeats grew louder, and Magnolia realized with mounting dread that her father would discover what she had done. But it was the stranger's final words, spoken just before he disappeared into the shadows, that made her blood run cold. "Tell your father that Ayanna of the Wind River people remembers this kindness, and tell him that 200 of my brothers remember his cruelty." Clayton Sterling's boots struck the marble steps like hammer blows as he stormed toward his daughter, his weathered face, carved by years of ruthless expansion across the territory, twisted with fury when he saw the empty bowl in Magnolia's hands. The silver spurs on his boots jangled with each aggressive step, a sound that had preceded violence more times than she could count. "What is that?" His voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Magnolia's throat went dry. Her father stood before her now, all 6 feet of him radiating the kind of controlled rage that had made grown men flee his presence. The expensive fabric of his coat couldn't hide the predator beneath, the man who had built an empire by taking what others claimed as theirs. "I was feeding the horses," she managed, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. Clayton's eyes narrowed as he scanned the courtyard. His gaze lingered on the spots where Ayanna's blood had stained the stone, already drying in the sun. When he looked back at his daughter, something cold and calculating had replaced the initial anger. "Horses don't bleed," he said quietly, kneeling to touch the dark stains. When he rose, his fingers came away red. "Tell me what happened here, Magnolia, and tell me the truth." The weight of his stare made her feel like a child again, caught stealing sweets from the kitchen. But this was different. This was dangerous. She could see it in the way his hand rested casually on the grip of his pistol, in the set of his jaw that meant someone was about to pay a price. "There was a man," she whispered. "He was hurt. Dying, maybe. I gave him some broth from the kitchen." Clayton's face went white, then red, then white again. The transformation was terrifying to watch. For a moment, he said nothing, just stood there processing what she had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Describe him." Magnolia's hands shook as she remembered Ayanna's face, the high cheekbones, the intricate beadwork on his torn clothing, the way his dark eyes had held both gratitude and warning. He was one of the natives, from the tribes up north, I think. He said his name was Ayanna. The color drained completely from Clayton's face. He took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. Around the courtyard, the ranch hands who had been going about their morning chores suddenly stopped what they were doing, sensing the shift in their boss's demeanor. "Ayanna," Clayton repeated, the name coming out like a curse. "Sweet mother of God, Magnolia, Do you have any idea what you've done? Before she could answer, a sound drifted across the valley that made every person on the property freeze. It started low and distant, like thunder on the horizon, but as it grew closer, it became unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding of dozens of horses approaching at full gallop. The thundering hoofbeats grew louder, and Clayton's face transformed into something Magnolia had never seen before. Pure, undiluted fear. This was the man who had stared down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers without flinching, who had built his fortune by intimidating anyone who stood in his way. But now his hands trembled as he grabbed her shoulders. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice cracking. "Lock the doors. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Father, what's happening?" Magnolia tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "What's happening is that you just fed the one man in this territory who has more reason to hate me than anyone alive." Clayton's eyes darted toward the approaching sound. "Ayanna isn't just any warrior, Magnolia. He's the son of Chief Dakota, and 3 months ago." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. The pieces clicked together in Magnolia's mind like a puzzle she had never wanted to solve. The newspaper clippings she had seen her father burning in his study. The hushed conversations between him and his foreman that stopped whenever she entered a room. The way he had started hiring more armed men to patrol the property. "What did you do 3 months ago?" she whispered. Clayton released her shoulders and turned toward the main gate, where a cloud of dust was now visible on the horizon. "I did what I had to do to protect our land," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Chief Dakota's people were camping by the river that runs through our property. They claimed it was sacred ground, said their ancestors were buried there. The hoofbeats were close enough now that individual horses could be distinguished. Magnolia counted at least 20, maybe 30 riders approaching. But Clayton wasn't finished with his confession. "They wouldn't leave," he continued, his voice barely audible above the approaching thunder. "So I hired men from town, professional men. We told them to clear the camp while the warriors were away hunting." Magnolia's stomach lurched. "Father, no. There were women there. Children. We thought they would just scatter, find somewhere else to go." Clayton's hands were shaking openly now, but some of them fought back. And when Ayanna returned with the hunting party and found what had happened, he didn't need to finish. The horror of it painted itself across Magnolia's imagination. A son returning to find his family dead, his sacred ground desecrated, his world destroyed by the man who now stood trembling on his own doorstep. The sound of horses reached the main gate, and through the morning haze, Magnolia could see them clearly now. Not 30 riders, but dozens more. They sat motionless on their mounts, forming a semicircle that stretched from one end of the property to the other. War paint streaked their faces and weapons glinted in the morning sun. At the center of the group, riding a massive black stallion, was Ayanna, even from a distance. Magnolia could see that his wounds had been tended to, that he sat straight and proud despite the pain he must have been feeling. In his hands, he held a long spear decorated with feathers that caught the wind. "How many?" Clayton whispered to himself, trying to count the assembled riders. But Magnolia had already counted. Just as Ayanna had promised, there were exactly 200 warriors surrounding her father's mansion, and every single one of them was looking directly at her. A silence fell over the valley that was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. 200 warriors sat motionless on their horses, their eyes fixed on the mansion like predators studying their prey. The only sound was the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees and the nervous snorting of horses. Ayanna raised his spear high above his head, and every warrior behind him did the same. The sight of those gleaming weapons catching the morning light sent Clayton stumbling backward toward the house, pulling Magnolia with him. "Inside now," he hissed, but his daughter planted her feet firmly on the marble steps. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "This is because of what I did. I need to face it." Clayton's ranch hands had emerged from the bunkhouse and stables, rifles in their hands, but they looked pitifully outnumbered. 15 men against 200. Even the bravest among them seemed to understand the futility of their situation. Ayanna nudged his stallion forward, separating himself from the group. As he approached, Magnolia could see that someone had cleaned and bandaged his wounds, and fresh war paint now adorned his face in patterns she didn't recognize. But his eyes remained the same, intelligent, pained, and now filled with something that looked like resignation. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the mansion steps and spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Clayton Sterling," he called out, "you know why I have come." Clayton stepped in front of his daughter, his hand finally drawing his pistol, The motion seemed almost comical given the circumstances. "What do you want, Ayanna?" The warrior's gaze shifted to Magnolia, and for a moment, his expression softened. "Your daughter showed me kindness when I was dying," he said. "She gave me food and water without knowing who I was, or what I represented. For this reason, I offer you a choice." Clayton's grip tightened on his weapon. "What choice?" Ayanna gestured toward the assembled warriors behind him. "Each of these men lost family in the massacre you ordered. Mothers, wives, children. They have ridden 3 days without rest to be here, seeking the justice that your law will never provide." Magnolia felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of her father's crimes became clear. She looked at the faces of the warriors, seeing grief and rage carved into features that should have shown peace. "The choice is this," Ayanna continued. "You can face judgment from my people for what you have done. Or," he paused, his eyes moving back to Magnolia, "your daughter can come with us willingly, to live among our people and learn our ways, to understand what was destroyed by your greed." Clayton's pistol wavered in his hand. "You want to take my daughter hostage?" "Not hostage," Ayanna replied. "Teacher, student, bridge between our worlds. She would be safe, honored, treated as family. But she would learn the cost of what happened by the river. If you were Magnolia, what would you do? Stay and watch your father face brutal justice for his crimes, or sacrifice your privileged life to save him and learn from the people he destroyed? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose. Because what Magnolia decided next would determine whether the Sterling mansion burned to the ground or stood as a symbol of something else entirely. Magnolia stepped forward before her father could stop her. The silk of her dress whispered against the marble as she descended the steps, each footfall echoing in the deadly silence. Behind her, Clayton's voice cracked as he called her name, but she didn't turn around. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "But I have conditions." A murmur rippled through the assembled warriors, and Ayanna tilted his head slightly, studying her with those dark eyes that had haunted her since their first encounter. "You are in no position to make demands," one of the warriors called out, his horse dancing impatiently beneath him, but Ayanna raised his hand for silence. "Speak," he said simply. Magnolia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "My father lives, unharmed. You take me, and you leave him to face whatever justice the territorial courts decide, not the justice of war." "Magnolia, no." Clayton's voice broke completely now. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes." She turned to look at him then, this man who had built an empire on the bones of other people's dreams. His face was streaked with tears she had never seen him shed, and for the first time in her life, he looked like what he truly was, a broken old man who had finally been forced to confront the consequences of his choices. "It's not sacrifice, father," she said quietly. "It's justice, the kind you should have sought before you ordered the killing of innocents." Ayanna dismounted from his stallion and walked toward her, stopping just close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, the careful patterns that spoke of artistry her world had tried to destroy. When he spoke, his voice was soft enough that only she could hear. "Do you understand what you are choosing?" he asked. "My people's way of life is not your father's mansion. There is no silk, no crystal, no servants to attend your needs. There is only the land, the seasons, and the bonds between people who have learned to survive together." Magnolia nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. "I understand, but I also understand that my comfortable life was built on the graves of your family. Maybe it's time I learned what that really means." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He stepped back and addressed the assembled warriors in a language she didn't recognize. The response was immediate and heated, voices raised in what sounded like argument or debate. After several minutes, Ayanna turned back to her. "My brothers are not all convinced that your offer is sufficient payment for what was taken from us. Some believe that only blood can answer for blood." Clayton had moved closer during the exchange, his pistol now hanging loosely at his side. "Then take my blood," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "I'm the one who gave the orders. I'm the one who should pay." "Father, no." Magnolia spun to face him. "This is my choice to make, and it's my debt to pay," he replied, meeting her eyes with something that might have been pride. "For the first time in my life, daughter, let me do something worthy of the woman you've become." The tension in the courtyard stretched like a bowstring. 200 warriors sat silent on their horses, weapons ready, while father and daughter faced each other across a chasm of years and choices. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that would wash the blood from the stones one way or another. Ayanna watched this exchange with the patience of a man who had learned that some decisions could not be rushed. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. But what none of them knew was that a lone rider was approaching from the east, carrying news that would change everything they thought they understood about justice, revenge, and the price of mercy. The sound of a galloping horse broke through the tense standoff like thunder splitting the sky. All eyes turned toward the eastern ridge where a rider approached at breakneck speed. His horse lathered with sweat and foam. Even from a distance, Magnolia could see that this was no ordinary messenger. The way he rode spoke of desperate urgency. Ayanna's warriors shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons as the unknown rider drew closer. But Ayanna himself remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the approaching figure with an expression that suggested recognition. The rider was young, perhaps no more than 17, with the same high cheekbones and dark skin as the warriors surrounding the mansion. His horse stumbled as he reached the outer circle of the war party, and he practically fell from the saddle in his haste to reach Ayanna. He spoke rapidly in their native tongue, his words tumbling over each other with barely contained panic. As he talked, Ayanna's face transformed from stoic composure to something that looked like shock, then growing horror. Clayton stepped closer to his daughter, sensing that whatever news the young rider brought would change the dynamics of their situation. "What's he saying?" he whispered. Magnolia shook her head, but she could read the body language well enough. The young man kept pointing toward the north, his gestures becoming more frantic with each passing moment. Several of the assembled warriors began talking among themselves, their voices rising in what sounded like alarm. Ayanna held up his hand for silence, then turned to face Clayton and Magnolia. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "There has been another attack," he said, the words falling like stones in still water. "A settlement 20 miles north of here. Women and children, all dead." Clayton's face went white. "That's impossible. I gave no such orders. I haven't hired any men since—" "Not your men," Ayanna interrupted, his eyes blazing with renewed fury. "White men, yes, but they wore the uniforms of territorial soldiers. They carried the flag of your government." The implications hit Magnolia like a physical blow. If territorial forces were conducting their own campaign against the native peoples, then her father's crime was just one small part of a much larger pattern of violence. The warriors who had come seeking justice for one massacre now faced the reality that others were happening even as they stood here. "My youngest brother was at that settlement," Ayanna continued, his voice steady but his hands clenched into fists. "He was visiting his wife's family, learning to be a father." He paused, and when he spoke again, each word was precise and cutting. "The messenger says they found him protecting the children. They shot him 17 times. The young rider spoke again, more urgently this time, and Magnolia saw several of the warriors beginning to turn their horses away from the mansion. "What is he saying now?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Ayanna's eyes met hers, and she saw in them a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "He says the soldiers are moving south, toward the winter camps where our elders and our sick take shelter when the weather turns cold." The math was simple and terrible. 200 warriors were here, seeking justice for one man's crime, while their most vulnerable people faced annihilation from an enemy they couldn't fight. "You have to go," Magnolia said quietly. "You have to save them." "Yes," Ayanna replied. "But first we finish what we came here to do." Ayanna turned back to his warriors and spoke in their language, his words sharp and commanding. The response was immediate. A heated debate erupted among the assembled riders, voices raised in argument that needed no translation. Some pointed toward the north, others gestured angrily at Clayton, and still others looked toward Magnolia with expressions she couldn't decipher. The young messenger spoke again, more urgently this time, and several warriors broke away from the group entirely, wheeling their horses toward the northern trail. Ayanna let them go without protest, but his jaw tightened as he watched them disappear over the ridge. "Time is running out," he said, turning back to face the Sterling family. "Every moment we delay here is another moment our people die." Clayton stepped forward, his pistol now holstered but his hands shaking. "Then go. Save your people. Consider my debt postponed." "Postponed?" Ayanna's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You think justice can be delayed like a business meeting? You think the dead can wait for your convenience?" "No," Clayton replied, his voice steadier now. "I think a man who has the chance to save lives should take it. even if it means letting a guilty man go free for now." Magnolia watched this exchange with growing understanding. Her father wasn't trying to escape justice. He was offering to live with the weight of his crimes unsettled, knowing that Ayana's people needed their warriors more than they needed his blood. But Ayana wasn't finished. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Clayton take an involuntary step backward. It was a necklace made of small bones and beads, clearly the work of careful, loving hands. "This belonged to my sister," Ayana said, holding it up so the morning light caught the intricate patterns. "She was 8 years old when your hired men found our camp. She was making this for her doll when they shot her." The words hit Magnolia like physical blows. She had imagined the victims of her father's crime as abstract figures, nameless casualties of his greed. But this necklace made them real. A little girl with clever fingers and artistic dreams, snuffed out for the sake of land that would never love Clayton the way she had loved her family. "I have carried this with me since I buried her," Ayana continued, waiting for the chance to place it around the neck of the man responsible for her death. He stepped closer to Clayton. The necklace extended between them like a bridge between two worlds. "But your daughter showed me something I had forgotten. She showed me that mercy exists even in the children of monsters." Clayton's breath came in short gasps as he stared at the small bones. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to wear this," Ayana said simply. "Every day for the rest of your life. I want you to feel the weight of those bones against your chest when you wake up, when you eat your fine meals, when you count your money. I want you to remember that every luxury you enjoy was paid for with the life of an 8-year-old girl who will never grow up." The courtyard fell silent, except for the wind and the distant thunder of more warriors departing toward the north. Clayton reached out with shaking hands and took the necklace, his fingers closing around the tiny bones. "And if I refuse?" he whispered. Ayana's eyes moved to Magnolia, then back to her father. "Then your daughter's kindness was wasted and I will hunt you down after I save my people. But if you wear it," he paused, "if you wear it and truly understand what it means, then perhaps some good can come from all this death." Clayton lifted the necklace over his head, with hands that shook like autumn leaves. As the bone settled against his chest, Magnolia saw something break inside him, some last vestige of the proud, ruthless man who had built an empire without counting the cost. More warriors were leaving now, the urgency of the northern crisis pulling them away from their quest for personal justice. But Ayana remained, watching Clayton Sterling transform into something smaller, more human, more broken than he had ever been before. "Will that be enough?" Magnolia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayana looked at Clayton Sterling, this broken man wearing the bones of a murdered child, and something ancient and tired seemed to settle in his eyes. Around them, more warriors continued their exodus toward the north, until fewer than 30 remained in the courtyard. "It will have to be enough," Ayana said finally, "because justice delayed for the living is better than justice that comes too late for the dead." He mounted his stallion with fluid grace, despite his wounds, and looked down at Magnolia one last time. "You saved more than my life when you gave me that bowl of soup," he said. "You reminded me that hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it longest." Clayton touched the necklace at his throat, his fingers tracing the small bones with something that might have been reverence. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you live with what you've done," Ayana replied. "Every sunrise, every meal, every comfortable night in your mansion, you remember her. You remember them all. And maybe," he paused, studying the man before him, "maybe you find a way to make their deaths mean something more than just your profit." The remaining warriors were growing restless, their horses dancing with impatience to join their brothers racing toward the winter camps. Ayana raised his spear one final time, but this wasn't a gesture of threat. It was a salute to something neither side fully understood, but both recognized as necessary. "If our paths cross again, Clayton Sterling, they will not cross in anger," Ayana said. "But they will cross in truth. The bones around your neck will see to that." With that, he wheeled his horse toward the north and galloped away, his remaining warriors following in a thunder of hoofbeats that gradually faded into the distance. Within minutes, the Sterling mansion stood empty of everything except the wind, the settling dust, and the weight of what had transpired. Father and daughter stood in silence for a long time, watching the last traces of the war party disappear over the horizon. When Clayton finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. "I don't know how to live with this," he whispered, his hand unconsciously moving to the necklace. Magnolia took his arm, feeling how much smaller he seemed now. how much of his imposing presence had crumbled away. "We'll figure it out together," she said, "one day at a time." Clayton Sterling never removed the necklace for the rest of his life. He wore it under his shirts, against his skin, feeling those small bones with every breath he took. The empire he had built through violence and greed slowly transformed into something else, a network of schools and medical clinics that served both white settlers and native peoples without distinction. Magnolia never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to building bridges between the worlds her father had tried to keep apart. She learned Ayana's language, studied his people's customs, and spent her inheritance creating safe places where children of all backgrounds could learn together. Ayana survived the Northern Campaign, saving most of his people from the territorial soldiers who had planned their destruction. He never forgot the young woman who had shown kindness to a dying enemy. And years later, when the wars finally ended, he would visit the schools that bore her name and tell the children how a single bowl of soup had changed the course of history. The Sterling mansion still stood decades later, no longer a monument to one man's conquest, but a symbol of what was possible when people chose mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo the longest through time, growing from whispers into thunder that reshapes the world. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.